I always considered myself the reliable daughter, the one who stepped up when family needed help most. When my father lost his engineering job 18 months ago, watching my parents struggle with bills and seeing my little sister Sarah stress about college tuition broke my heart. So I made a decision that felt right at the time. I became their financial lifeline, sending $2,800 every month to keep our family home and Sarah's dreams alive. Those first few months felt wonderful, knowing I was the reason my family could sleep peacefully at night. But then I started noticing small things, that made my stomach twist with doubt. Before we dive into what happened next, I would love to know where you are watching from. Please hit that like button if you have ever felt taken advantage of by family. And do not forget to subscribe, because trust me, you will want to hear how this story unfolds. Let me take you through the moment I discovered just how far my own blood relatives were willing to cross the line. My name is Audrey. I'm 32 years old, and I work as a senior marketing manager at a tech company here in Seattle. My salary is comfortable, nothing extraordinary, but enough to live well and save for the future I always planned. My family means everything to me. There is my father, David, 58 years old, who spent 30 years as a construction engineer before the economic downturn hit his company hard. My mother, Linda, 55, works part-time at a local grocery store, bringing in just enough to cover her gas and personal expenses. Then there is Sarah, my 24-year-old sister, a senior at the State University studying graphic design. Our family was always close-knit. Growing up, we had Sunday dinners every week, family vacations to the Oregon coast, and birthday celebrations that felt like small festivals. Dad taught both Sarah and me how to change tire pressure and balance a checkbook. Mom made sure we knew how to cook clean and manage a household. We were not wealthy, but we were stable, happy, and secure. That security crumbled when Dad received his termination notice in March of last year. The construction industry took a massive hit, and his company laid off 60% of their workforce. At 58, finding equivalent work proved nearly impossible. Every interview ended with polite rejections, usually citing concerns about training costs or long-term employment potential. The rejections hurt Dad deeply, and I watched this strong man who raised me begin to question his own worth. The financial pressure mounted quickly. Their mortgage payment alone was $2,000 monthly, plus utilities, insurance, groceries, and Sarah's tuition. Mom's part-time income barely covered groceries. Their savings disappeared within 4 months. I watched my parents' stress levels skyrocket as they fell behind on bills, and Sarah worried constantly about having to drop out of college just months before graduation. That was when I stepped in. The decision felt natural, almost automatic. I loved my family, I had a stable income, and I could afford to help. So I started sending $2,800 every month to cover their mortgage, utilities, and Sarah's tuition. The relief in their voices when I first offered was worth every penny. Dad cried on the phone, which I had never heard before in my entire life. Mom kept saying she did not know how to thank me. Sarah immediately called to tell me I was saving her entire future. For the first few months, everything felt perfect. I felt needed, important, like I was making a real difference in the lives of people I loved most. When I visited for Sunday dinner, the atmosphere was lighter. Dad seemed more hopeful, actively applying for jobs without the desperate edge he had before. Mom was cooking elaborate meals again, not just basic sustenance. Sarah was thriving in her final year, talking excitedly about internships and career prospects. I made adjustments to accommodate this new financial responsibility. I canceled my planned vacation to Europe, moved from my downtown apartment to a smaller place in a less expensive neighborhood, and cut back on dining out and entertainment. These sacrifices felt meaningful, purposeful. Every dollar I saved was a dollar that kept my family stable. The first warning sign appeared in month 6. During a casual family dinner, I noticed Sarah carrying a beautiful leather handbag that definitely was not from Target or any store Sarah usually shopped at. When I complimented it, she beamed and told me it was a gift from her boyfriend Marcus, who she had been dating for about 3 months. The bag looked expensive, probably $700 or $800, based on the craftsmanship and brand name I recognized. Something about the casualness of her response bothered me, but I pushed the feeling aside. A few weeks later, Sarah posted Instagram photos from a weekend trip to Napa Valley with her college friends. The pictures showed them at high-end wineries, staying at a boutique hotel, eating at restaurants I knew charged $50 per entree. When I asked about it during our next phone call, Sarah explained that Marcus had surprised her and her friends with the weekend getaway as an early birthday present. Again, that uncomfortable feeling stirred in my chest, but I told myself to stop being paranoid. The feeling grew stronger in month 7 when I arrived at the house for an unexpected visit and found Sarah's bedroom sporting a massive new television, at least 65 inches mounted on the wall, with a sophisticated sound system. When I asked Mom about it, she explained that Sarah needed it for her graphic design projects, something about color accuracy and screen resolution being crucial for her final portfolio. That explanation might have satisfied me if I had not found the Best Buy receipt in the kitchen trash later that evening. The television cost $2,200, the sound system, another $400. The receipt was dated just 3 days earlier, and it was paid for with the credit card I had been helping them pay off each month. When I brought this to Mom's attention, she became defensive, insisting that Sarah's education required proper equipment and that this was a necessary investment in her future career. I left that night feeling uneasy and somewhat foolish. Part of me wondered if I was being overly suspicious of normal family expenses. Another part of me, the part that balanced my own budget carefully and understood the value of money, knew that a $2,600 entertainment system was not a necessity for anyone, especially someone whose education was being subsidized by her sister's sacrifice. The unease turned into genuine concern the following month when I decided to review the credit card statements more carefully. What I found made my stomach drop. Mixed in with legitimate expenses like groceries, gas, and utility bills were charges that had nothing to do with basic family needs. Nordstrom purchases totaling $800. Sephora charges for $300 worth of cosmetics. Restaurant bills from places I knew charged $40 to $60 per person for dinner. When I added up the questionable expenses, they totaled nearly $1,500 for that month alone. I sat in my car outside their house for 20 minutes trying to process what I was seeing. These were not emergency expenses or one-time purchases. This was a pattern of spending that suggested someone was using my financial support as a source of discretionary income rather than basic survival. I knew I needed to address the situation directly, but I also knew I needed to approach it carefully. These were not strangers misusing my money. This was my family, people I loved and trusted. I spent several days thinking about how to bring up my concerns without sounding accusatory or controlling. Finally, I decided to call a family meeting to discuss our financial arrangement and establish clearer boundaries. I arrived at their house on a Thursday evening with printouts of the credit card statements and a calm, prepared speech about responsible spending. I had highlighted the questionable expenses and calculated the total amount that seemed to be going toward non-essential items. My plan was to have a mature conversation about needs versus wants, and to establish a budget that everyone could agree on. The conversation did not go as planned. When I laid out the evidence in front of them, the reaction was immediate defensiveness rather than understanding. Dad initially seemed embarrassed and started to apologize, but Mom quickly jumped in to justify every expense. The Nordstrom purchases were professional clothes Sarah needed for job interviews. The makeup was necessary for maintaining a professional appearance. The restaurant meals were study sessions with classmates and networking opportunities. Sarah's reaction was the most intense. She accused me of being controlling and invasive, demanding to know why I was monitoring every dollar they spent like some kind of financial dictator. Her voice raised as she explained how stressful her final year of college was and how she deserved a few small luxuries to help her cope with the pressure. She started crying, saying she felt like she could not enjoy anything without her sister judging her choices. The guilt hit me immediately. Looking at my little sister's tear-streaked face, I started questioning whether I was being unreasonable. Maybe I was being too rigid about money. Maybe I did not understand the pressures she was facing. Maybe these expenses were not as frivolous as they seemed from the outside. By the end of that evening, I had agreed to continue the financial support, but asked them to be more mindful of unnecessary expenses. Everyone promised to be more careful with spending, and Sarah gave me a long hug, thanking me for understanding and being the best big sister in the world. I drove home feeling better about the situation, convinced that we had cleared the air and established better communication. For about 2 weeks, everything seemed improved. The credit card charges returned to reasonable amounts, mostly groceries, gas, and utilities. Sarah called me twice that week to thank me again and to share excitement about an internship opportunity she was pursuing. I felt relieved and slightly ashamed that I had doubted their intentions. That relief was short-lived. At the end of month 8, I received an alert from the credit card company about an unusually large charge. When I checked the statement online, I found a $1,200 charge to a high-end spa and wellness center. The charge was dated on a Tuesday afternoon when Sarah should have been in class. When I called to ask about it, Sarah's explanation was that she had been having severe anxiety about her upcoming final exams and job interviews. Her academic advisor had recommended stress management techniques, and she felt that a spa day with massage, facial, and aromatherapy treatments would help her mental health. She spoke about it as if it were a medical necessity rather than an expensive luxury. I was furious, not just about the money, but about the casual way she presented this $1,200 spa day as stress relief. I thought about the stress I was feeling from working extra hours to afford supporting them, the stress of living in a smaller apartment and skipping vacations so I could send them money each month. The idea that my stress was acceptable, while hers required expensive professional treatment, felt deeply unfair. Our phone conversation that day was the first time Sarah and I had truly argued as adults. I told her the spa day was completely unacceptable and that she had broken the promise we made just 2 weeks earlier. She responded by accusing me of not caring about her mental health and being unsympathetic to the pressure she was under. The conversation escalated until we were both yelling something that had never happened between us before. When I called my parents to discuss the situation, I was shocked by their response. Instead of supporting my position, they defended Sarah's choice. Dad said that young people today face different pressures than our generation, and that mental health was just as important as physical health. Mom pointed out that $1,200 was less than I spent on my car payment each month, so it was not like Sarah was being extravagant. That comparison stung particularly deeply, because my car payment was for reliable transportation to the job that enabled me to support them. The fact that they could equate my necessary expenses with Sarah's luxury treatments showed a fundamental misunderstanding of our financial relationship that troubled me deeply. The tension in our family continued to build throughout the rest of that month. Every conversation felt strained. Every family dinner included subtle references to money and stress. I began to feel like the villain in my own family, the uptight sister, who could not understand that other people had needs and deserves too. At the end of October, I received a notification from the bank about an unusual cash advance on the credit card. When I checked the details, someone had withdrawn $3,000 in cash from an ATM near the university. The withdrawal happened on a Friday afternoon, and no one had mentioned any emergency or special need for that amount of cash. I immediately tried calling the house, but no one answered. I called Sarah's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried calling Mom's work number, but they said she had left early for a family event. The phrase family event made my blood run cold because I had not been informed of any family event. I drove to their house immediately, my heart pounding with anxiety and anger. When I arrived, the house appeared empty, but there were clear signs that a large gathering had taken place recently. The living room furniture was rearranged. There were extra chairs set up, and I could smell the lingering aroma of catered food. The kitchen counter was covered with expensive-looking disposable plates and wine glasses that definitely had not come from their normal dinnerware collection. I sat in my car in their driveway, staring at the evidence of what was clearly an expensive party that I had not been invited to, funded by money I had provided for their basic living expenses. The betrayal felt physical, like someone had punched me in the stomach. I started shaking as the reality of the situation became clear. I spent the next hour searching through social media, looking at Sarah's Instagram stories and those of her friends. What I found was worse than I had imagined. Sarah had thrown herself an elaborate 24th birthday party, complete with professional catering, premium alcohol, and decorations that probably cost hundreds of dollars. In one video, I could hear Sarah telling her friends about how lucky she was to have a sister who was financially successful and generous enough to support the family during tough times. In another video, Sarah was showing off a new designer dress, explaining to someone off camera that she had been able to afford it because her sister helped with family expenses, freeing up money for personal purchases. She said it with such casual entitlement, as if my financial sacrifice was simply a resource she could draw from whenever she wanted something special. The worst moment was watching a video where Sarah raised a glass of what appeared to be expensive champagne and toasted, "To family who support your dreams and never make you feel guilty about enjoying life." The irony of that statement, given how much guilt I had been made to feel for questioning her spending, was devastating. I drove home that night in a state of emotional numbness. I felt like the biggest fool in the world for believing that my family appreciated my sacrifice and was using my help responsibly. Instead, they had turned my financial support into a source of discretionary income while making me feel guilty for questioning their choices. Over the next few days, I did something I probably should have done months earlier. I went through 6 months of credit card statements and added up every expense that was clearly not related to basic living costs. The total was staggering $14,500. Sarah had spent $14,500 of money I provided for survival on clothes, makeup, entertainment, luxury experiences, and her birthday party. To put that in perspective, $14,500 was more than half of what I had given them in total support. It meant that instead of barely scraping by, as I had believed, they were actually living quite comfortably while I made sacrifices to support what I thought was their desperate situation. The betrayal went beyond just the money. What hurt most was the dishonesty, the manipulation of my emotions, and the way they had made me feel guilty for being concerned about expenses that were completely inappropriate given their supposed financial crisis. I spent a weekend planning what I was going to say when I confronted them. I knew this conversation would change our family dynamic permanently, but I could not continue enabling behavior that was not just financially irresponsible, but also morally wrong. On Monday evening, I drove to their house with all the evidence organized in a folder. I had highlighted every questionable expense and calculated running totals to show the pattern of misuse. I also had a written statement explaining my decision to discontinue financial support because I knew the conversation would become emotional and I wanted to stay focused on facts. When I arrived, the family was gathered around the dinner table, looking happy and relaxed. Sarah was talking about a job interview she had scheduled for the following week, and my parents were discussing plans for Thanksgiving. The normalcy of the scene made what I was about to do feel even more difficult. I placed the folder on the table and told them I needed to have a serious conversation about our financial arrangement. The mood in the room changed immediately. Dad set down his fork, Mom stopped mid-sentence, and Sarah looked at me with an expression that was part defiance and part fear. I opened the folder and began showing them the evidence systematically. Every highlighted charge, every calculated total, every example of how money intended for survival had been spent on luxuries. I spoke calmly, stating facts rather than accusations, but the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Sarah's initial response was to deny that the expenses were inappropriate. She argued that the clothes were for job interviews, the makeup was for professional purposes, and the entertainment expenses were networking opportunities. When I pointed out that job interview clothes do not cost $800 and networking does not require $60 dinners, she switched tactics and began crying. Through her tears, Sarah accused me of being controlling, manipulative, and jealous of her social life. She said I was trying to keep her from having any happiness during a stressful time in her life. She claimed that I was using money as a weapon to control her behavior and that my expectations were unreasonable and cruel. My parents' reaction was even more disappointing than Sarah's. Instead of being appalled by the misuse of money I had provided in good faith, they defended her choices. Dad said that Sarah was young and deserved to enjoy life while she could. Mom pointed out that I made good money and could afford to be generous without tracking every expense like an accountant. The conversation escalated when I explained that I had decided to stop providing financial support immediately. The reaction was explosive. Sarah accused me of abandoning the family during their time of need. Dad said I was being vindictive and punishing them for minor mistakes. Mom cried and said she did not understand how I could be so heartless toward my own family. What struck me most was that not one of them apologized for misusing the money. Not one of them acknowledged that spending $14,000 on luxuries while claiming financial desperation was wrong. Instead, they all focused on making me feel guilty for stopping my support. I told them that I had already made arrangements to cancel the automatic payments and that they would need to figure out their own financial solutions going forward. I explained that I no longer trusted them to use any money I provided appropriately, and that I would not continue enabling irresponsible spending. Sarah's response was to scream at me that I was destroying her future and ruining her final semester of college. She accused me of being jealous that she was young and attractive and popular, while I was old and bitter and alone. Those words cut deep, especially the suggestion that my single status was somehow a character flaw that made me resentful of her happiness. I left their house that evening feeling emotionally drained, but also strangely relieved. For months, I'd been carrying the stress of supporting another household while questioning my own reactions to their spending. Now I knew that my concerns had been completely justified and that my family had been taking advantage of my generosity in ways that were both financially irresponsible and morally wrong. The first 3 weeks after cutting off financial support were among the most difficult of my life. My family called constantly, leaving voicemails that alternated between pleading and accusatory. Dad would call to explain how stressed Mom was about the bills. Mom would call to describe how Sarah was crying every day about having to drop out of college. Sarah would call to alternate between apologizing and blaming me for destroying her life. The emotional manipulation was intense and persistent. They painted me as the villain who had abandoned her family during their darkest hour, conveniently forgetting that their darkest hour had included spa days, designer clothes, and luxury entertainment. Several times I almost gave in and resumed the payments just to stop the guilt and restore peace in our family. During this difficult period, I decided to seek professional help to process my feelings about the situation. I found a therapist who specialized in family financial issues, and our conversations were extremely enlightening. She helped me understand that what I had experienced was a form of financial abuse, where family members manipulate emotions to access money inappropriately. Through therapy, I learned that my initial instinct to help my family had been loving and appropriate, but that their response to my help had crossed important boundaries. She explained that when people become entitled to financial support without accountability, they often lose sight of the sacrifice involved and begin to see the support as a right rather than a gift. The therapy sessions also helped me understand that my decision to stop providing money was not only financially wise, but also potentially beneficial for my family in the long term. By enabling their irresponsible spending, I had been preventing them from learning important lessons about budgeting, prioritizing expenses, and living within their means. As I worked through my feelings about the situation, I began to rebuild other aspects of my life that I had neglected during the months of financial stress. I rejoined the gym I had canceled to save money. I started going out with friends again, instead of staying home to preserve every dollar for family support. I even signed up for a photography class, something I had wanted to do for years, but had postponed due to the expense. Slowly, I began to remember what my life had been like before I became responsible for another family's financial well-being. The relief was enormous, but it was accompanied by sadness about the changes in my family relationships and uncertainty about whether those relationships could ever be repaired. 2 months after I stopped the payments, I learned about some of the consequences my family faced. They were forced to sell their house and move into a much smaller rental apartment. Sarah had to take a semester off from school to work part-time and save money for tuition. Dad finally found employment, though, at a significantly lower salary than his previous job. Initially, they continued to blame me for these hardships. The voicemails and text messages painted me as the person responsible for their reduced circumstances. Sarah sent me pictures of her small new bedroom, comparing it unfavorably to her previous living situation, and describing how embarrassed she was to bring friends over. After about 4 months of limited contact, Sarah called me with a very different tone than I had heard from her in months. Instead of anger or manipulation, her voice carried what sounded like genuine remorse. She asked if we could meet for coffee to talk about everything that had happened. When we met, Sarah looked different. She seemed more mature, less entitled, and genuinely upset about how she had treated me. She started by apologizing, not just for the inappropriate spending, but for the way she had responded when I confronted her about it. She admitted that she had known the expenses were wrong, but had convinced herself that she deserved them because of the stress she was experiencing. Sarah explained that having to work part-time and manage her own finances had taught her lessons about money that she had never learned before. She said she finally understood the sacrifices I had made to support the family and felt ashamed of how casually she had treated my generosity. She also acknowledged that her accusation about me being jealous and bitter had been cruel and completely unfair. The conversation was emotional for both of us. I could see that Sarah had genuinely grown from the experience of having to be financially independent, and I felt hopeful that we could rebuild our relationship on a healthier foundation. However, I also made it clear that any future financial help would come with strict conditions and clear boundaries. My parents took longer to come around, but eventually they also acknowledged that my decision had been appropriate. Dad admitted that he had been so focused on avoiding the embarrassment of their financial situation that he had not paid attention to how my support was being used. Mom said she had been so grateful for my help that she had not wanted to question Sarah's spending for fear that I would stop helping altogether. 6 months after ending the financial support, our family relationships had stabilized in a new and healthier pattern. We still had regular contact, but the dynamic was more balanced. Instead of me being the family bank account, I was back to being a sister and daughter whose opinions were respected rather than manipulated. Sarah finished her degree the following year, paying for her final semester with money she earned from her part-time job and a small student loan. The graduation ceremony was emotional for all of us, but in a positive way. Sarah's speech thanked our family for supporting her education, but she specifically mentioned learning the value of hard work and financial responsibility. Looking back on that difficult period, I realized that the decision to cut off financial support was one of the most important choices I have ever made. It was painful at the time, and it temporarily damaged some of the most important relationships in my life. However, it ultimately led to a stronger, more honest family dynamic and taught all of us valuable lessons about money boundaries and respect. The experience taught me that genuine love sometimes requires making unpopular decisions. When I was enabling my family's irresponsible spending, I thought I was being loving and supportive. In reality, I was preventing them from growing and learning important life skills. By forcing them to face the consequences of their financial situation, I gave them the opportunity to develop resilience, responsibility, and self-respect. I also learned that financial boundaries are just as important as emotional boundaries in family relationships. When family members have access to someone else's money without accountability, it can create unhealthy power dynamics and unrealistic expectations. Clear agreements about financial support, including specific purposes and spending limits, can prevent misunderstandings and resentment. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that my own financial security and peace of mind are not selfish priorities. For months, I had felt guilty about being concerned with how my money was spent, as if my feelings about my own financial sacrifice were less important than my family's wants and needs. The experience taught me that taking care of myself financially and emotionally is not only acceptable, but necessary for maintaining healthy relationships with others. Today, our family relationships are stronger than they were before the financial crisis began. We communicate more honestly about money and expectations. Sarah has become genuinely responsible with finances and frequently asks for advice rather than assuming support. My parents have developed a more realistic understanding of their financial situation and have made lifestyle adjustments that allow them to live within their means. The most important lesson I learned is that real love sometimes means allowing the people you care about to experience the consequences of their choices. When we protect others from the results of their actions, we rob them of the opportunity to learn and grow. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to step back and let people figure out their own solutions, even when it is difficult to watch them struggle. True family support is not about providing endless financial resources without questions or boundaries. It is about helping each other become stronger, more responsible, and more capable of handling life's challenges independently. Sometimes that means saying no, setting limits, and allowing natural consequences to teach lessons that words cannot convey. If you have ever been in a situation where you felt taken advantage of by family members, please share your story in the comments below. Have you ever had to make the difficult choice between helping and enabling? I would love to hear your thoughts on how to balance family loyalty with personal boundaries. Please like this video if you think setting financial boundaries with family is important. Subscribe for more stories about navigating difficult family situations, and share this video with anyone who might be struggling with similar decisions. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes the hardest choices lead to the strongest relationships. Taking care of yourself is not selfish. It is necessary for taking care of others in healthy ways.